Today, the carrion birds feast, but they will feast upon our enemies, not on good Roman flesh!
Battles like you never saw, a sprawling imperial campaign, and a wealth of factions that allowed us to play out the most pivotal wars of the classical world. If you're anything like me, Rome Total War blew your mind away back in the day, and it may even continue to do so over 20 years later. If you find yourself in the ages between 25 and let's say 40, chances are your first Total War game was Rome. At least, I'm willing to bet that a plurality of veteran Total War players have Rome as their first introduction to the series. Now that's a legendary first meeting if I do say so myself, because Rome symbolized a generational shift not just for this series, but for the strategy genre as a whole. Indeed, few strategy games even to this day manage to bring the grandness, carnage, depth, and scope that Rome managed to deliver all those years ago. Perhaps this is why Rome is CA's first venture into remastered titles, as Rome is currently the only Total War game that got a fully fledged update, other than of course the mobile titles. In this review then, we'll talk about what made the original Rome so great, and we'll analyze the remaster 2 for that ultimate Rome Total War deep dive. It's hard to believe it now, but there was a time when I had no idea Total War games even existed. Before putting thousands of hours into complex strategy games like Paradox and Total War titles, I stuck to the simpler life, and luckily, I found myself in the glory days of movie-licensed RTS games, getting absolutely psyched playing my way through the campaigns of Battle for Middle-earth, Star Wars Empire at War, and Command and Conquer Generals, which honestly I consider something of a spiritual movie tie-in to the movie Team America. But one day, everything changed. The classic Rome Total War trailer of a commander making a weird face as he ran his blade through an enemy made me as hyped as a 13-year-old could be, and soon I too was playing as none other than the Red Romans, who we all know are the one true Roman faction. But what was it that made Rome Total War so legendary, so awesome, so unique in the minds of the fans? I'll tell you my thoughts, but share with me your perspectives as well, as I'd love to get to know and hear from even more of you. Make sure to join the Discord too, and join the Total War conversation there. In an age where Total War games look like this, or even this honestly, it might seem weird that Rome ever looked good. But my dude and dudette, back in its heyday, Rome was revolutionary, not just for these absolutely sick graphics of course, but for the entirety of the experience. Rome offered a grand campaign focusing first and foremost on the Romans. What absolutely blew me away was the sandboxiness of it all. Whereas before, I was playing campaigns that were mostly scripted or at least railroaded, Rome Total War was completely open, but perhaps not entirely historical. Instead of one, we got 3 Roman factions in red, green, and blue, and they all had just as much beef with each other as they did with the other countries out there. Like literally think of this as Mafia Total War, but only one of the Mafia families have estates in Sicily, and they're all basically starter Pokemon in red, blue, and green. And of course, since my starter is Charmander, you're gonna bet I'm Juliai's biggest fan. All my homies love the Julii, and hate the Gauls. The first thing that meets you in Rome is that gorgeous campaign map. It's an entire world out there, from Britannia in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, all surrounded by that beautiful campaign music. I honestly still believe this looks good, and I think it comes down to that timeless art style. It's colorful and soft, but not cartoony. Back in the early 2000s, this was as realistic looking as strategy games got, and seeing as it was the first fully 3D Total War, it's just really impressive. Like, look at the detail here. We not only have varied landscapes, from northern European forests to Mediterranean coasts to Middle Eastern deserts, but we also have unique monuments and wonders. They don't only look amazing either, as they provide bonuses for your entire faction if you control them, and you get these awesome little videos whenever you capture them. Back in these days, every city had the potential to become a massive one, with every building available everywhere, except for ports which require a seaside location. This means that there are no provinces, no inherent minor settlements, but complete freedom in which cities make it big, determined entirely by population sizes and your investments into them. I always found this system more rewarding than the province system that began with Rome 2, as this one just made it feel more like you actually developed your entire country, and the lack of restrictions in terms of how many building slots you had enhanced that feeling. The same goes for building roads and farms and ports, and I really enjoy this level of micromanagement which has yet to return to the Total War series. If CA could just learn to keep their best mechanics for the next game instead of instantly forgetting them and forcing themselves to reinvent the wheel, that would be great. The awesome thing was that your population even impacted your potential army and city size. You always needed a certain amount of people to upgrade your cities to higher levels, but the more people you made into soldiers, the less there were to drive that economic growth. Similarly, disbanding soldiers put those men back into the population pool, which also effectively allowed for controlled migration from one city to another. This is actually such an awesome feature when you think about it, but has to my knowledge never been implemented again. Of course, we also had fort placements, which allowed us to customize the map in our own way, creating choke points and strong military fortifications where we needed them. Even though Rome Total War is mostly a sandbox experience, we do have a mechanic which to a certain extent determines our campaigns, the Senate. I told you previously that Rome was divided into red, green, and blue, but there's another, a secret fourth color, known as purple, the Senate and People of Rome. This is the faction actually in control of Rome, and the Senate is an entire mechanic in and of itself. Here, the Senate may love or despise you, and we see that the same goes for the people in your realm. Being loved by both is important, especially because being loved by the Senate means that your characters might be appointed to senatorial positions which grant them various powerful modifiers, and because if it goes too low, the Senate might declare war on you. Even though it's a rather simple premise, I really like how it's done. The Senate has its own diplomatic opinion of other factions, and will often dislike the factions the Romans are at war with, or like the ones they have positive diplomatic agreements with. In turn, they will often give you missions to conquer foreign enemy lands or conduct hostile campaigns against them. Some are more natural than others, however, and it can be frustrating when it asks you to blockade a Spartan port in only 5 turns when you're playing as the Julii and are far away. Gaining favor with the Senate is good insofar as it brings you powerful Senate positions, but at some point, the Senate will dislike you for becoming too powerful, especially if you gain the love of the people. At one point, you will be able to declare war on the Senate and march on Rome itself, fighting each of the other Roman factions at the same time. Even though it might be a bit of a crude system, I love it, and you're guaranteed a late game challenge every time. It's just such a sick feature that took me by surprise, and the fact that you fight other Romans, meaning people just like you, only differently colored armor, makes it a truly impactful and campaign-changing experience. Of course, there are more factions here than just the Romans, and by default, these are unlocked once you defeat them. Back in the day, I had absolutely no issue with this, and I saw it as an incredibly smart way of unlocking more of the game as you went, kinda like achievements, but with gameplay rewards. This made it possible to play as Rome's enemies and adversaries, like Carthage, Macedon, the Gauls, Scythia, and a variety of other factions around the world. Depending on where you are, they offer entirely different vibes than Rome, with different religions, buildings, music, and units. The only thing that kinda sucks is that they don't really feel as unique. There are no missions, for example, no equivalent government mechanics like the Senate system, and so it's basically a conquer the world sandbox game with few other aspects. Whereas the Romans have the civil war as an endgame mechanic, the endgame challenge of every other faction is kind of just meeting and fighting the Romans themselves, who of course consists of 4 factions including the Senate. It is fun playing the non-Romans though, if only for the flavor and the various starting locations around the world, but the Romans is definitely where the bulk of the game's features lie. Of course, if you live for the sandbox and find the Senate mechanic or missions annoying, then these non-Roman factions might even be preferable to you. Of course, Rome also featured a signature family tree system. Your generals, their wives, and kids all featured here, allowing for campaigns that felt personal because the important family members served as generals and governors, received positive or negative traits depending on their actions, and it all added a ton of role-playing gameplay. It's honestly one of the best features of the game period, and it was awesome that fighting battles without a general, which yes, that was a feature in the old Total War games, allowed for a captain, the hero of the hour, to make their mark on the campaign, and let you choose to adopt them into your family as a general. See what I mean about this being Mafia Total War yet? The campaign was not the only thing that hooked me to Rome Total War, as the battles were arguably the single most awesome feature of the game. Being not just an upgrade from previous Total War games in terms of the beautiful graphics, Rome was also such a noticeable step up from any other RTS games out there. I mean, whereas Star Wars Empire at War gave me a few dozen or perhaps 100 units to mess around with, Rome gave me thousands, even tens of thousands at the most, on massive battlefields or indeed in the cities themselves. and the field battles were just as awesome as the city battles with those massive sieges. I imagine I was not alone in wanting to play battles that mimicked those in the Lord of the Rings, and Rome actually allowed me to do that. Heck, it even had total conversion mods that made the game into a grand strategy Lord of the Rings game. Not that I would know that until a few years later, of course, but still, it was there, and it was possible. It's almost crazy when you think about it, just how far ahead Rome was versus other games in terms of that epic scale and the breathtaking visuals, and the fantastic and epic soundtrack made this experience a godly mix. The battles of Rome also taught you, rather well I'd say, about the wars of the ancient world. The Romans used tactics and things like pila tossing to peel away their enemies before engaging, whereas the Gauls were a bit less organized but could hit hard as nails, and facing the Greeks was tougher, as those massive pikes and phalanxes were really hard to deal with head-on. Others still prefer to use mobile and ranged cavalry, which to a more static Roman army could be devastating. This meant you had to use different tactics based on which enemy you fought, and it was just as much fun every time. Now in hindsight, there are of course many things that are not optimal about Rome's battles, such as pathfinding for example. But that's kind of the luxury of being a kid, isn't it? You don't really notice those things as much, or you simply don't care because of how awesome the overall experience was. You might notice something is off or that a unit doesn't respond, but your mind explains it away as there's something natural that happens sometimes. This game allowed me to experiment with so many unit combinations, pitting the best of Rome against the best from elsewhere, and that feeling of beginning somewhere in the world, but 100 turns later fighting in completely different and foreign environments is something I just absolutely love. Rome Total War allowed us to play from the Punic Wars around 270 BC to the time of Emperor Augustus, although none of these events or people actually made appearances in the game as they historically did. This is the classic Rome experience, and I will always cherish it. But Rome offered even more. The Alexander expansion offered a somewhat tighter experience where we actually played as the historical Alexander fighting the Persians. I didn't own this myself back in the day but tried it much later, and I have to say that I never really liked it all that much. It mostly comes down to the map, which is just so tiny and weird looking that you'd think it was a joke. The expansion I absolutely loved, however, was the last one, Barbarian Invasion. Now I bought the Rome Total War Gold Edition way back when, and that package came with both the original game and BI. The back of the game box said, play as one of the 3 great Roman families whose thirst for power will stop at nothing. You must use military genius to build an empire that stretches across Europe and Africa. Finally, march on Rome to seize control of the greatest empire in the world. Then, in Barbarian Invasion, having built your empire, you can defend it as either the Eastern or Western Roman Empire, or lead a barbarian horde and bring the once mighty empire to its knees. And I literally thought that this meant that the empire I had made could be converted into this new scenario. This wasn't exactly the case. Instead, Barbarian Invasion takes place in the 4th century after the split of the Roman Empire into East and West. Instead of beginning small, we now begin massive, and these 2 empires now control about half the world between them. Both of these must now deal with the titular barbarian invasions, including the Huns, Vandals, Goths, and the rivaling Sassanid Empire, but the Western Roman Empire is certainly the harder faction to play as here. There, public order issues, religious fervor, and the lack of money absolutely devastate your empire unless you act quickly, but no matter what you do, it's going to take a while before the empire is safe again. A reason for this is the entirely new mechanic of religion. The Roman Empire struggled with the battle between Christianity and the old Roman pantheon, and both cities and generals will swear loyalty to either one. In turn, you can build churches and use various generals to turn the tide of faith for either side, although doing so can be difficult if your empire is divided in faith. The faction leader's faith also means a lot, as that is the effective state religion. Each city also has a dominant religion, but differing from the state religion gives that city minus 10% public order, which can definitely hurt if the city's loyalties are wavering already. What's awesome is that it's totally up to you if you wish to further the power of Christianity or re-paganize, which adds a ton of role-playing value to this campaign in particular. I've always loved Barbarian Invasion for that challenge as the Romans, and I think it does a really great job of portraying the era. Of course, there are other factions here as well, so once again, it's possible to do your best to topple the Romans, either as the relatively mighty Sassanids in the east or the various barbarian factions in the north. They will too eventually run into the religious problem, but since they begin small or isolated from the rapid Christian spread, the other factions are much more stable to begin with. The complete Rome Total War experience kinda gave us the most quintessential eras of Rome then, and even though the original game will always remain the classic experience, Barbarian Invasion turned out to be a fantastic campaign that I never knew I wanted, but one which I suddenly never wanted to be without. Rome Total War might be old, being perhaps the most important reason as to why it got a fully remastered version in 2021, but its foundations linger in the Total War series to this day and shows just how revolutionary and awesome this 2004 title actually was. This leads us to Total War Rome Remastered, and more than just a title change, it's also a game that launched as highly controversial, but which since has grown to become a truly amazing title. Rome Remastered is a modern upgrade through and through, despite the underlying foundations largely remaining as they were, for better or worse. Thing is, the game is gorgeous, completely overhauled with more realistic visuals, more detail, better post-processing effects, units finally look like individual people with different outfits depending on the unit and so on and so forth. It really is a game changer. In battles, you can finally use modern controls to form your units and turn the camera, and on the campaign, we have a new notification center where messages can be read more than once, and this is very neat in particular. The old music of Jeff Van Dyke luckily makes a glorious return, and there's a lot of granularity in terms of visual and game settings, even allowing us to choose between every available faction without having to defeat them first. The game runs much better than the old titles because of being able to utilize modern hardware, and there's been done a host of bug fixes and other updates, which in many ways makes this the superior Rome Total War experience. Virtually every major mechanic in Rome functions the way they always have, and even though I found it a bit more confusing and useless than its Medieval 2 counterpart, we also got the addition of merchants on the campaign map. Perhaps the coolest thing about Rome Remastered was the implementation of Steam Workshop integration and the erasing or outright removal of modding limitations. Rome Total War always featured amazing mods that did so much to enhance the experience, but it was always limited by a few things like faction or city upper limits. Now though, we have a mod like RTR Imperium Surrectum, which at various points have featured a city number of around 2,000. That is 10 times more than the original Rome could possibly hope to include due to engine limitations, and whether you enjoy that many cities or not, the fact that it's at all possible is a gaming miracle as far as I'm concerned, and playing Rome Remastered with mods like Imperium Surrectum or a number of other outstanding mods has been a true joy, especially since this behemoth is still being updated and worked on. I mentioned that Rome Remastered was controversial, and this surely rang true on launch. A bunch of creators got to play it in the weeks leading up to release, which honestly, I don't know if that was such a good idea. Not because the game wasn't good, but because people likely got tired of seeing so much of the game before it even launched, and it probably had the creators themselves burn out on it due to the perceived need to make content and play endless campaigns. Of course, Rome Remastered had some major or arguable flaws as well. While the visuals looked more modern, they also significantly altered things like the campaign map, which always was iconic and remained something people were looking forward to seeing again, just, remastered. With new colors, perspective, and importantly, a new approach to campaign map art design itself, the map appeared very different from its original state. You might say it's better or worse, each to their own, but there's no denying the difference, and I think this turned a lot of people off. The same probably went for things like actual engine limitations, which made it tough for developer Feral Interactive to iron out the most egregious bugs, where units just won't move in certain types of settlements. These and other issues like them concerning weird movement or behavior is often known as pathfinding issues, and even though Feral might have fixed some of them, they're still definitely a part of certain aspects of Rome Remastered, which feels strange considering that essentially buying a version of the game, which should in theory be an objective improvement, still harbors occasional game-breaking bugs. We also cannot forget to mention the perhaps most controversial change, namely the UI. Whereas the original game had a static and marble-based UI, a classic Total War UI if you will, that really felt tailored for PC games and made a lot of sense for Rome, the updated UI didn't feel as good, at least not initially. Many people, including myself, felt that it was too inspired by mobile or otherwise more modern and generic approaches to UI, and since this is a strategy game, this mattered to a lot of people. This UI change alone might have honestly made a large chunk of people not buy the game, which is a great shame, but still understandable. Personally, I find it works well at this point, especially because Feral updated the windows to be able to expand, rather than just giving us tiny windows of the units or buildings. I would prefer the original UI though, and as Feral is so good with these days, a toggle for new or old would be great. Total War players have been long neglected when it comes to the multiplayer scene, with no historical title featuring an online co-op campaign with more than 2 players, or even simultaneous turns, which is ridiculous. Rome's campaign is fantastic, but the hope of a multiplayer campaign, which despite the 2-player limitation had become standard in the series, truly set the hearts of many, including myself, on fire. I would have loved a multiplayer campaign for Rome. In fact, I would have gladly paid for a multiplayer campaign expansion, and I believe that if it had been there, the game would have sold tenfold of what it actually ended up doing. I mean, who doesn't want to play as different Roman families with their buds, right? But sadly, a multiplayer campaign never came. Whether that comes down to engine limitations or just a lack of development budget, or a mix, I don't know. But Rome Remastered's legacy was probably forever tarnished because of this one single quote-unquote missing feature. With all of that being said, Rome Remastered is one of my favorite Total War games, and if I am going to play Rome these days, Rome Remastered is the game I launch. It's beautiful, it runs well, and it offers mods that in some cases far surpass those of the original, purely because of the lifted limitations. Despite its lacks, I think more people should test it if they feel like returning to Rome Total War, not just because it features every Rome campaigns in one package, which means Rome, Alexander, and Barbarian Invasion, but because of all of the charm it still retains, and because this game, through the modders, still has a future. The Rome series is one of CA's most popular. In fact, when combining Rome, Rome Remastered, Rome 2, and Attila sales, it's likely to be the most popular of the series in the historical Total War library, especially in the West. Despite this, it's now actually been a whole 4 years since Rome Remastered released, 12 years since Rome 2, and 21 years since the original Rome Total War saw the light of day. When or if we'll see a Rome 3 is not for me to say, but it's absolutely high time we get one that's hopefully focused on returning to the granular, fun, and charming experience that Rome embodied so well all those years ago. Let me know what you think of Rome and Rome Remastered in the comments, and tell me what your best experiences with the games are, whether it's a battle or campaign moment. Thank you so much for watching, remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!